Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Resolution Foundation. On this Monday morning, we're going to launch Hannah and Imogen's paper, Precarious Prospects. My name is Gregory Thwaites. I'm a research director at the Resolution Foundation. Going from my left to my right, we have Olivia Vickle on the panel. Olivia co-founded the Workers' Rights Centre, which does both grassroots activities and now is a leading advocate for migrants' rights. We have Manoj Diaz-Abe, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol Law School, investigating how Britain thinks about, rationalises and regulates labour migration. We have Professor Alan Manning from the London School of Economics, who, amongst many other things, was chair of the Migration Advisory Committee. And last, well, in fact, first as well, because she's going to introduce her report in a minute, we have Hannah Slaughter, senior economist at the Resolution Foundation. So how's this going to work is we're going to have Hannah talk for a few minutes, and then the panel will have some time for some remarks, and then we'll have time for some discussion from the panel, and then questions from the audience here in Westminster and then also online. So please use Slido if you want to do that to pose your questions. So I'm just going to ask Hannah to kick off now with her slides, please.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Greg. And just to say at the outset, thank you also to Unbound Philanthropy who've supported this work, and also a big thank you to my co-author, Imogen. So I'm going to take us through just a short presentation of some of the key findings to set up the discussion. So today's report focuses on the UK's foreign-born workforce. So this is a very kind of plural group. It's quite a large group. Foreign-born workers make up about a fifth of the workforce, everywhere from kind of growth-driving sectors like kind of IT and tech, right through to critical public services like health and social care. And so that means that there's a really kind of wide variation in experiences. So more than a third of foreign-born workers are in occupations that the ONS classifies as high skill. So things like IT and finance, based on that's high skill based on typical qualification requirements, and they tend to have a pretty good labour market experience overall. But there are others, especially in some of the more precarious sectors like hospitality and social care, who face more of a risk of precarity in the labour market. And it's this latter group that today's report focuses on. So I'm going to take us through three different aspects of precarity that we look at in the report and explore the differences in the experiences of foreign-born workers compared to those born in the UK. And the first one we're going to look at is contract types. So here particularly focusing on flexible contracts, things like 0 hours contracts and temporary work, things that can be beneficial for some workers. It can allow people to fit work around other aspects of their life. But there are lots of ways in which they can be more precarious, especially if those workers don't have kind of the control over their hours, for example. So this is the first chart, and I'm going to build up a bit more. So firstly, here, these purple bars are the share of workers born in the UK who are on each of 0 hours contracts, variable hours contracts where the hours are set by the employer, and also where that affects their pay, because they're paid kind of by the hour, by each hour they work. And temporary non-contract work. So this is things like not just fixed-term contracts, but more things like seasonal work, casual work, temporary agency work. And then at the bottom there, you've got the shares of just over 1 in 10 on any of these flexible contracts. So this is those born in the UK. The first group of foreign-born workers that we look at throughout this report are those who were born abroad but are now UK citizens. And here actually there's their experiences aren't so different from those workers born in the UK. So there are slightly lower shares of this group on 0 hours and variable hours contracts, slightly higher share in temporary non-contract work. But overall a very similar share, also about 1 in 10 on any flexible contract. Next, we've got in orange here those foreign-born workers who've been in the UK for 5 years or more, so that longer-term residents. And again, there's not a huge difference with those purple bars with those who were born in the UK. Again, a slightly higher share, about 11% on any flexible contract, but by and large, not a vast amount of difference here. But where we really see the big difference and the big disparity is when we look at those foreign-born workers who've been in the UK for less than 5 years, so more recent arrivals. And here we can see that they've got higher rates of being on 0 hours contracts, quite substantially higher rates of being on these variable hours contract where they don't have control over their hours and where that affects their pay, and higher rates as well of being in kind of non-contract temporary work. And overall, you can see at the bottom there that around 1 in 6, so just over 16%, are on any or perhaps more than one of these kinds of contracts. And you might think maybe that's explained by something like, for example, it might be that these foreign recent arrivals are younger, say, and we know that younger workers are more likely to be on these kinds of contracts for a wide range of reasons, and it might not be to do with migration status at all. But actually, when we control for other characteristics, so here we're controlling for age and sex and qualification level, we see that the gap remains. So this isn't a pattern that's explained by people's characteristics. So this is kind of looking at the likelihood of being on any kind of flexible contract relative to those born in the UK. So we've got about 1.2 and 1.5 times as likely for those longer term residents, but those aren't statistically significant. But then again, at the bottom in green, we find that more recent arrivals are around 2.4 times as likely to be on one of these flexible contracts, even after accounting for their demographic profile. The second aspect of precarity that we look at is a lack of employment rights. So that might be because workers are owed employment rights, but they're not getting them. We know that non-compliance is a big problem in general in the UK. Our previous work has shown that. Or it might be because they're in employment statuses where they don't have as many rights attached as an employee might have. And so, if I can fast forward. On non-compliance, we look at this a bit in the report, but we're using largely quantitative data, household surveys. It's something that's really difficult to look at, and so we don't find particularly high risks of, for example, minimum wage underpayment among recently arrived foreign-born workers. But we know from the wider qualitative evidence base from other organisations, and including some of those on the panel today, that there are big issues here affecting some groups of foreign-born workers. When it comes to non-compliance. And part of the reason for that, which will kind of come on later when we talk about policy, is that for foreign-born workers, if they are to go and complain to an enforcement body at the moment about unlawful treatment in the workplace, they face the risk of their details being passed on to the Home Office, which understandably deters particularly people with insecure migration status, but also other foreign-born workers too, from approaching the authorities when they're facing that kind of treatment. And there's also particular issues, again, linked to care worker visas and basically visas that are linked to a specific employer inherently create kind of a power imbalance. Workers are more reluctant to complain because they risk losing their job, for example, if they either complain to their employer or if they complain to an enforcement body. So that's something that kind of very much quantitative evidence is less well placed to show the evidence on. But there's also another side, so beyond kind of non-compliance with rights, there are some workers who just don't have the full rights of an employee in the first place. So the UK has quite a complicated system where we've got employees, we've got self-employed workers who have very few rights, and the kind of trade-off there is they should get more autonomy, or they will kind of come on to cases where that's not true in a moment. And then there's a kind of interim status called workers, or sometimes known as limby workers, where workers on kind of more casualised contracts have fewer rights than an employee might have. So there's kind of some workers who just don't have all of the rights of an employee in the first place. That's quite difficult, again, to look at in survey data, but we do make an attempt at it. So firstly, to kind of proxy for kind of worker status issues by looking at the gig economy, where this is by no means the only place where these issues have come about, but they've definitely been in the spotlight. And we find that particularly both recently arrived and longer term foreign-born workers who aren't UK citizens are around 3 times as likely as those who either were born in the UK or have become citizens to be in the gig economy. And then we also look at different kinds of self-employment that might be precarious. So firstly, we look at solo self-employment, where again it's a very mixed group. You can be kind of quite a well-paid freelancer with lots of control over your over your working hours and lots of autonomy, but it can also be a place where there's more precarity, and so we find here that particularly longer term residents are more likely to be in solo self-employment. But then the bottom set of bars is the kind of far more concerning group where these people are solo self-employed, so they are self-employed without employees, but they also either say that they don't have any autonomy over some aspect of their work, or that they're paying tax through an employer or not submitting kind of business accounts to HMRC. And these might be signs of so-called bogus self-employment, where workers are told that they're self-employed, they're legally they're kind of treated as self-employed in terms of rights, in terms of tax, but actually the work that they're doing might look very much like that of an employee. And so this is kind of a bit of an aggregate measure, so taking together those kind of flexible contract types and the different kinds of self-employment that might be more precarious. And here we're also focusing particularly on those who are either low paid or on a below average income, because clearly if someone is on a 0 hours contract, say, but actually they have a relatively high household income, they're not relying on that pay for lots of their kind of family's income, then it's not as problematic. But if you're on a low income, then it very much can make it harder to cope with that financial precarity. And so here we see on that measure that there's kind of a gradient from just under 1 in 10 people who are born in the UK being in this kind of precarious work, increasing slightly to 11% among UK citizens who were born abroad, and then 15 and 16% respectively are foreign-born workers who have been in the UK for longer than 5 years or arrived more recently. And again, this isn't accounted for by their characteristics, so when we adjust for the same set of factors as we did before, we find that those who've arrived in the past 5 years are 3 times as likely as UK-born workers to be in precarious work. It's worth saying, we haven't got a chart on it here, but in the report, and perhaps we'll get into it in the discussion as well, is that this is an overall picture, but when you look at some sectors, when you look at, for example, some ethnic minority groups, in fact most ethnic minority groups we're able to look at in the data, we find far higher rates of precarious work. So this is kind of very much just the headline picture. And then the final aspect of precarity, just quickly, is job insecurity. So all the measures that we've looked at so far are linked to the kinds of work that people are in, but actually people in any kind of work can feel precarity if they think it's likely that they might lose their job. And so here we look at people saying that whether they, as a bit of a proxy for that, people who think it's likely or very likely that they'll lose their job in the next 12 months. So here we see that the kind of bottom bar, those recently arrived foreign-born workers actually have very similar rates of thinking they're likely to lose their job than those born in the UK, so 6 and 7%. But we see far higher rates of this kind of concern over job loss among UK citizens who are born abroad and longer-term foreign-born workers. But what this chart doesn't show, it shows, it's basically the question in the survey data is, do you think you're likely to lose your job? But what it doesn't capture is that for some groups of foreign-born workers, job loss can have more severe consequences when it does happen. So for people whose visa is tied to their employer, losing their job might mean losing their right to remain in the UK. And for those with no recourse to public funds, if they do lose their job, they don't have access to the kind of state safety net that a UK-born worker or other groups of foreign-born workers might. So job loss can absolutely have more severe consequences if it does happen. And so just quickly to end on some thoughts on policy, which again we'll get into a bit more in the discussion. There's a clear rationale for policymakers to act, partly just because, as we've shown in this analysis, foreign-born workers in lots of cases can be more vulnerable to precarious work, but also because if we're allowing kind of one group of workers to work under lower standards or to kind of have these conditions of higher precarity, it can have knock-on impacts across the workforce and drag down standards for the workforce as a whole. So firstly, I mentioned it kind of briefly, tied visas that are tied to a specific employer, and there's kind of clear reason to act to think about how to better protect workers on those visas so that imbalance of power from having your right to remain in the country being linked to your job doesn't lead to greater precarity and in some cases exploitation. So we don't say in the report kind of exactly what route the government should take, but some options include either making it easier for these workers to switch sponsors, or creating kind of visa arrangements that if a worker leaves an exploitative employer, for example, they can have these kind of an interim visa to ensure that they're still able to remain in the UK. But there's also lots to do on the labour market policy side. And so we've got the Employment Rights Bill currently going through Parliament, and we think that the government should build on the momentum of that and make sure that foreign-born workers are robustly protected. And in particular, we think that there's a clear kind of urgency around the new Fair Work Agency, which is the single enforcement body that will enforce workers' rights, to make sure that they are protecting foreign-born workers who come to them with a complaint. So creating a data firewall between the Fair Work Agency and immigration enforcement to stop that problem that I mentioned earlier, where foreign-born workers are fearful of, in many cases, of approaching an enforcement body because they know that there are really close ties with the immigration system. And we also think that there's reforming worker status is really hard, and it's there's lots of thinking to do about it, but it's really urgent, a really urgent thing to get our heads around, so that there aren't these kind of loopholes where employers, kind of unscrupulous employers, can bypass higher standards on employees by putting workers on a different status. And then finally, just kind of recognising that trade unions and worker tech platforms and kind of wider labour market institutions also have a really valuable role to play, and are playing a really valuable role already in supporting migrant workers. So obviously that's really valuable and should continue, and it's also really important for kind of join up between the government and these wider labour market institutions to kind of collectively protect foreign-born workers and ensure that standards are upheld across the labour market.
Thank you very much, Hannah. All right, I'm going to ask Alan to come in now, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Hannah, very much. That was very informative. It's on a very important question, and it's also very timely given we have the Employment Rights Bill and also possibly, changes to the immigration system following on from the white paper that's supposed to be coming. I'm going to concentrate my remarks on what I think are some of the implications for migration policy. I'm going to distinguish between behaviour that is unlawful and behaviour that is lawful but might be treating people not very well. And obviously there's also a question about what behaviour should be lawful or unlawful. I'm not really going to get into that so much. So I start by just talking about unlawful behaviour. Some of this is not stuff that is migrant specific, like underpayment of the minimum wage. That's unlawful for everybody. But some of it is going to be sort of related to the interaction with migration laws. Sometimes it's going to be just the employer of the migrant who's breaking the law. So on the social care visa, we've had a lot of problems with employers basically not paying people what they're supposed to have been paying them under the terms and conditions of the visas. That's a specific employer. Unlawful behaviour, it's not the fault of the worker. But then there are also going to be situations, most commonly around unauthorised work, where it is both the employer and the migrant worker who is engaged in unlawful activities. And I think in the case where it's just the employer breaking, the laws, we need to have much more enforcement than we currently have had on that. As I think I agree with what Hannah said, that even where it's both the worker and the employer, you actually want to focus the penalties much more on the employer than we currently have. And traditionally, we haven't got that balance. That's balance right. So even where the worker themselves is engaged in unlawful behaviour, I think it should be the balance of the enforcement should be on the employer. Now, I'd want to sort of step back from that and say, what are the wider implications for policy? So if a particular visa has got serious compliance and enforcement problems associated with it, those are reasons why you're less likely to want that visa in the first place. Because enforcement and compliance, that costs resources. And a good example of that would be the investor visa, that was sometimes called the golden visa, that attracted lots of shady, sort of dodgy characters, and you had to do due diligence on whether there was going to be reputational damage by admitting these kind of people. And after a while, that due diligence, that enforcement compliance costs are so large, you think this visa just isn't worth bothering with, we're just going to get rid of it. But I fear that actually on the social care visa, all these compliance and enforcement problems also push you towards saying, actually, this visa is not a good idea. If you're going to have that visa in those kind of sectors with these problems, perhaps that goes on the negative side of why you would not want this visa. Are there arguments on the positive side? So that's about unlawful behaviour. Now just sort of poor treatment. Here, the idea that I think is kind of quite important is an idea that Philip Martin and Martin Roos put forward, which is what they call is the numbers versus rights trade-off in migration policy. And their argument is basically that the more rights you give migrants who are in the country, the lower the level of net migration is likely to be, because the poor treatment of the migrants is the point of many of these visas. That is the mechanism by which these visas deliver benefits for the local residents. And you know, a very stark example of that would be comparing, say, somewhere like Dubai. Something like over 80% of the population is migrant compared to, you know, sort of 20% that we're talking about here. The migrants have many, many fewer rights, but that, you know, that gives benefits to the locals, the locals there, which you wouldn't have if the migrants were forced to being treated equally. And we've seen exactly those trade-offs happen in UK migration policy. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, had all that shortage of HGV drivers. And you know, quite a lot of people saying, well, we need 100,000 migrant drivers to that. You might have noticed that we don't have that problem anymore, but it hasn't been because we've had 100,000 migrant truck drivers. It's because we've increased the pay of HGV drivers. And so, you know, and similarly, as in social care, the Home Office, having been asleep at the wheel on these sort of compliance and enforcement issues, as they have tightened up on that, we've seen numbers come right down. So again, as you move the rights in one direction, you push the numbers in the opposite direction. And so I think that, you know, that, and, you know, the seasonal agricultural workers is another example where, you know, you have to sort of trap workers in these sectors because you're going to pay them less than the market rate for these jobs. If you give them freedom to move, they'll move for exactly the same reason that the locals move. And so then you've got a choice really about, these are people, these are members of our society, they're going to be treated much less equally. And so our society is going to be more unequal. But as you reduce that inequality, you're likely also to reduce the levels of net migration. So I don't have a particular, you know, I think there are arguments for and against different points on this, but a lot of the discussion of immigration is, you know, on the one side you have people who want lots of rights for migrants, lots of immigration. On the other side, people who want very little immigration, not bothered about the rights of migrants. And neither of those positions are actually where migration policy is most of the time. It's on this sort of, the other combination, high rights, low numbers, or high numbers, low rights.
Thank you very much, Alan. Olivia, I'm going to come to you next.
Thank you, Gregory and Hannah. That was a great report. I thought it was full of nuance. And I think the one silver lining from it is that overall, if you look at the figures for migrants who've been in the UK for longer than 5 years, the indicators for precarity are lower, right? So on the one hand, you can read it as a story of integration. On the other hand, as your report shows so well, precarity does remain entrenched and they're still disproportionately represented in these roles. So I'm going to focus my intervention on what I think are 3 key structural drivers that generate and intersect with the picture of migrant precarity you presented. I'd like to start by looking at the provision of employment legal advice. There isn't much of it. For over 10 years now, employment has been excluded from legal aid, which means that currently workers who find themselves in precarious roles and who want to actively challenge it have very few places to go. Unions would be the natural place for them to go and seek support. However, another really important statistic is that migrant workers are significantly underrepresented in union membership. So the limited availability of legal advice for employment is one structural issue that I think intersects with the picture you've presented. In addition to that, the second thing I want to turn to is the state of the employment justice system. The Resolution Foundation, I think, in the past did fantastic work documenting just how fragmented and under-resourced the labor enforcement system is at the moment. That's really difficult to navigate for workers, and it's complex and fundamentally ineffective. It's great news that this government is looking to implement a single enforcement body, that's the Fair Work Agency, but I think the ultimate success of this really depends on the details of implementation. We know that currently the UK has about a third of the labour enforcement officer contingent that's recommended by the ILO. It's really key for the success of the Fair Work Agency for that to meet ILO standards. Equally, we think, given everything you found in this report, and given that some of the disproportionate presence of migrants in precarious roles is not something you can explain statistically, it's really important for the Fair Work Agency to listen to migrant workers and their representatives themselves and include them, as you suggest, in the advisory board. And the third thing I would like to reflect on, probably in more detail, is the immigration system that we have after Brexit and the incredible power imbalance it creates between workers and their employers. So the Work Rights Centre is a charity that provides employment and immigration legal advice, and I think for the past couple of years, since care worker and senior care worker roles have been added to this system of employer sponsorship, there isn't a day when we don't hear from at least a handful of migrant care workers who have been abused by their visa sponsors. And I think it's really important to understand that this is not a story of individual vulnerability, and it's not a story of evil employers alone. These are behaviors that are also systemically encouraged and enabled and tolerated by the immigration system in its current form. So currently, if you're a migrant worker and you want to come to work in the UK, you need to have a visa that's sponsored by an employer licensed by the Home Office. So the Home Office really puts employers in a great position of power. If your job with your employer ends, you have just 60 days to find someone else. And I think everyone here who's tried to find a job knows that 60 days is really not a lot of time. And even if you find another licensed employer, you need to then pay for another visa. And that's a significant investment. The result of this, as we've seen it, has been a picture of real exploitation that I think amounts to a national crisis. On the one hand, we see people who've been completely duped into paying for legitimate visas and thinking they would arrive here and have a real position, only to then come to the UK and realize that the position never materialized. They're basically trapped in a system where they're not allowed to work anywhere else. On the other end of the spectrum, we've seen employers who've completely abused the system by overworking and underpaying workers. So I think reform at the level of the work migration system is really key. And this includes both widening protections for workers and increasing, as Alan said, the penalty regime for employers, because what's extraordinary is that even though currently an employer risks a £60,000 fine if they hire someone without the right to work, they risk no fine at all if they lie about the job and abuse the sponsorship system and abuse workers themselves. So yeah, that's my conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivia. Manoj.
Oh, thank you very much. So thank you very much for the invitation. The Resolution Foundation has been really, I think, influential in sort of debates around work. So I'm really pleased to see its recent attention on precarious work and trying to tackle that. I think it's very important. So the report looks mainly at those born outside the UK and has, as Anna explained very well, this includes those who are non-citizens or don't have indefinite leave to remain, and that means people that are subject to the immigration system, the immigration rules, and those who are naturalized or have indefinite leave to remain. They also include workers who are racialized in particular ways and those who are not. And the former group, obviously, it's important to think about that because they may be subject to discrimination and stereotyping when they're looking for work and once they find employment. So I think place of birth, migration status, and racial ethnic identity are all really important to think about when considering this population. They are distinct but overlapping categories. And analytically, I think how you splice things up makes a big difference because each category has different dynamics that are operating. So someone who's born overseas and recently migrated might end up in precarious employment because they lack facility in English or have weaker social ties and networks. Others might end up in precarious employment because of their migration status. And Olivia, you covered that very nicely, that you could lose your sponsor and the difficulties of finding an alternative. But migration status can operate sometimes in very paradoxical ways. So a foreign-born spouse of a worker who comes in on a skilled worker visa has greater labor market mobility than the primary visa holder themselves. So yeah, it's quite complicated. So what I thought I'd do in my remarks is try and address some of the questions that we were asked to think about, and hopefully I can touch upon at least 2 or 3 of those questions in a meaningful way. So what's life like for people who are foreign-born subject to these sort of forms of precarious work? And well, it's not great. There's rampant wage theft, not receiving sufficient or consistent hours of work, working in environments that are dangerous or cause ill health, a lack of holiday entitlements, and there's lots of evidence to this effect. But I think it's also, when you're thinking about precarious employment, it's important to think about what impact that has on other domains of their life. I'm thinking of a really wonderful book that was recently published, I think it was last year, by Catherine Barnard and a few of her colleagues at Cambridge. I think it's called Low-Paid EU Migrant Workers. And what was really striking about that book for me was the really vivid picture it painted of precarious employment and its concatenating effects in lots of different domains, right? So if you don't have stable employment, you end up indebted, you end up in poor quality housing, you end up being unable to access healthcare and missing out on whatever meager government benefits that you might have entitlement to. In terms of the sort of the systematic or structural issues that sit behind it, the report does a great job, and I think some of my fellow discussants as well, of highlighting things, poor enforcement, no recourse to public funds, the tied visa, of course. But I think really, I would say this as a labor lawyer, but I think really sits at the root of the problem is the lack of worker power. The employment relationship is a deeply unequal one. Workers need their job a lot more than employers need workers. And this is particularly the case where workers may not have skills that they can necessarily market in the labor market, and of course employers can recruit from a global labor market. So collective labor relations, I think, allow some measure of balance to be returned, but we know that union density is quite low, so we have to be quite creative about how we do this. And there are some features in the Employment Rights Bill, I think, that I find very encouraging in this regard. So, for example, I'll go on to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but with some of the regulation around the 0-hour contracts, employers can essentially deviate from some of that regulation if they enter into a collective agreement with the relevant trade union, with the relevant workers. So that would be, I think, a really interesting, those sort of measures to encourage and promote collective labor relations in circumstances where they may not exist. So let me quickly, if I've got a couple more minutes maybe, just turn to the Employment Rights Bill. I would say that we know what areas the Employment Rights Bill will address, but it's still going through Parliament, and of course lots of different aspects remain to be elaborated in regulation. So we don't have a complete picture. And with all things employment law, the devil's in the detail. And so we have to sort of withhold too much judgment immediately. But there are 2 things in the Employment Rights Bill that I just wanted to highlight, which I think has a bearing on our conversation today. The first is the regulation of 0-hour contracts. This is one of the big sort of ticket items that the government's been talking about. It means that people who are either not guaranteed any particular hours of work or guaranteed a very low number of hours of work with variable hours inbuilt will now be given the opportunity to have a contract with guaranteed hours reflecting the hours worked in the reference period, which remains to be elaborated. The talk is it's going to be 3 months. And there's also measures in there to provide reasonable notice of shifts and compensation for cancelled shifts. So I can see something like that having a very important impact in this regard. The other is unfair dismissal. Some of the changes around that. Job security is really important because people can't be sacked unreasonably. Currently only applies to employees with 2 years qualification period, and we can see how that affects migrant workers, foreign-born workers who might have very short-term visas. The plan is to abolish the qualification period, but have some sort of probationary period where a lower standard might apply. But the big problem with, I think, unfair dismissal, it only applies to employees, and we know there are lots of categories of workers that fall outside of that thing. So I'd like to say I'm cautiously hopeful about the employment rights bill. There's lots of things in there that do, I think, that will have a positive effect. But there are 3 things that are that have been delayed, which I think push in the opposite direction. So we know that the knotty issue of employment status will not be resolved. It's been kicked into the long grass. Enforcement, yes, we do have a sense that there's going to be some consolidation of the Fair Work Agency, but as the reviewer again was saying that we don't really know whether additional resources are going to be given. We don't know whether the modes by which they operate will necessarily shift in a significant way. And social sectoral bargaining for the social care sector, that too is something that will not happen immediately. So, the employment rights bill is not going to be a panacea, but I think it is very helpful in terms of shifting the dial on some of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manoj. All right, so what I'd like to do now is split the discussion that we're going to have into roughly 3 parts. First of all, why is this happening? Why do we see the phenomena that Hannah very clearly set out in her presentation? Then secondly, what are the effects of these phenomena, both broadly in the economy, but then also on the people in question? And then last but not least, what might we do about this if we think it's a problem? So let me start with why is this happening? By the way, you can ask questions in the room. Imogen has a microphone if you want to put your hand up about the kind of why issue. And then I've also got some questions online, and I'll come to those in the course of this discussion, but I'll turn to Alan first. Why do we see what Hannah showed us?
I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm going to say something actually about the tied visas, which I think is relevant. So firstly, of new migrants, workers in the UK, it's probably only a half at the moment who are actually on tied visas. As Manoj said, they're all the dependents of those in tied visas. They're all the international students, both the students on graduate visas, they're the family migrants, they're the people who've got refugee status, and so on. And if you add up all of those numbers, it's only about a half that are on tied visas. So most of what is happening here is nothing to do with tied visas. And in fact, tied visas properly enforced have lots of provisions in them which would stop all of this. Like, I think, if might not be quite right on this, that on Hannah's criteria, a tied visa properly enforced would not be precarious work on any of these definitions. Have to be an employee, have to be full-time, have to be guaranteed a salary which is actually above the minimum wage. And those provisions are in there in part to protect the migrant workers. So the downside of it has been that the enforcement has been incredibly weak. And there are aspects that are very hard to enforce. So actually how you're treated, how much you're asked to work and so on, that's very hard to legislate from the outside. So I'm not saying that you should not have this ability to leave employers who treat you badly. But the main problem with tied visas has been the lack of enforcement of the existing rules, not the rules around them, I think.
Would anyone else on the panel like to come in? And if anyone has a question on this topic in the room, please raise your hand. Olivia.
I'd like to add to that. That's right. According to the rules, workers under tied visas should be treated fairly. But I think it's precisely because we have such evidence that shows that this enforcement is not possible in practice, and there is such a culture of non-compliance, and the sanctions for not complying are so minimal. That's probably the key reason why the work visa system needs to be reconfigured to begin with. Even in the employment tribunal ordinarily, even workers who have more flexibility, 4 out of 10 cases never received the awards they were given. So the issue of non-enforcement is so pervasive across the UK. I think that's the strongest reason why the work migration system needs a rethink.
I'll just add two things. I think there's ongoing kind of academic discussion and debate about what constitutes precarious employment, and of course temporariness is an important facet, but not having access to regulatory protections, not having much control over the way that you work. Those are all other features. There are two categories of tied worker visas that we need to be particularly attentive towards, and those are workers that are coming under the seasonal agricultural worker program, and they're not insignificant numbers, right? We're talking about 45,000 a year, and they're here for less than 6 months every year, living on employer-provided accommodation. So that in itself is a sort of a vector of vulnerability, I think. And often the just structure of the program is so complex that few of the people that operate the system seems to know about how it works, and certainly the workers don't really know who they can get in touch with when there are problems. And the other smaller category are workers here on the overseas domestic worker visa as well. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think there's about 20,000 here. And again, incredibly precarious tied visas in both of those two programs. But yeah, I think, Alan, your point certainly stands more broadly.
Hannah, do you want to come in?
I don't have huge amounts to add beyond what people have already said, but I think Manoj's point in his opening remarks were about kind of at the heart of all of this is a kind of clear imbalance of power, whether that is related to the visa system, whether it's because, as I said in my presentation, migrant workers are often, it's much more difficult for them to go to the labour market enforcement bodies because they have, running this risk of their details being passed on to the Home Office. There's kind of, it all comes back to kind of different aspects of work power, which is
There's a question online, if I may, if we can put it up. And the question is, has this insecurity always been the plight of lower paid foreign-born workers? Or is it a unique feature of globalised labour markets and late-stage capitalism? Now, I think just on the premise of that question, if you'll indulge me, it's about 4% of the global population lives in a country that they weren't born in, which is a lot lower than it is in the UK, and that's mainly because China and India don't have very many international migrants in them. They've got lots of huge domestic relocation of workers. So I mean, that's in the eye of the beholder whether labour markets are globalised. I suppose it's also in the eye of the beholder whether we're in late stage capitalism now. I mean, they didn't call the Middle Ages in the Middle Ages. It wasn't until something came afterwards that they figured out they were in the middle of something. So maybe we're just at the beginning of capitalism, who knows? But the basic point of the question, which is, has it always been like this? And maybe relatedly, is it always like this in other countries? Is a very good one, and I'd invite the panel to comment on that.
I think the answer is yes.
Okay, it's a short answer to a very long question that I posed.
Elaborate on that, but yeah, I mean, it's not very hard to go back in history and find lots of examples of this. Whether it was Irish workers in the 19th century, or even going back beyond that. Yeah.
Anyone else want to come in on this point, Olivia, and then Manoj?
I think to some extent, capitalism that is premised on that power imbalance. There's also racialized capitalism at play. But my caution against generalizing this and attributing it to these superstructures is that we don't want to normalize it, and we don't want to bring it to a level where it's so abstract that it lets policymakers off the hook.
Manoj?
Yeah, I'll leave aside the kind of the theory of capitalism here and just address the other aspect. But what I would say is I think we go around in circles with some of this stuff. So I'm thinking of some of the temporary worker programs that we had in the post-World War II era. We recognized many of the problems with it. Eventually, they were largely, they stopped being used. And they sort of started to come back with a vengeance in the 1990s. And now it's a very significant form of significant mechanism for labour migration, and so we sometimes end up repeating the mistakes of the past. And certainly on the kind of the geographical question, yeah, a lot of countries, Canada, Australia, other high-income countries that have large migrant worker populations are all having to deal with some of these same issues. But there are interesting policy implications in some of these other jurisdictions that I think we can look and learn from.
Hannah, anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I will say, I think something that, I mean, maybe it doesn't quite address the kind of, what's happened over the longer term point, but I do think that there are some, like some of the, in the report we do look a bit at kind of where, like particular sectors where foreign-born workers are kind of particularly concentrated, and we see that there are some, you know, so we obviously look at social care in particular, and there's obviously issues around visas there, but there's also, these are also sectors in a lot of the cases where we look at, so the social care is also hospitality, a few others as well, whereas kind of there are growing issues just in the labour market in general. So I think you kind of get whatever's happening in the long term and kind of that's affecting migrant workers specifically, and then also some kind of pockets of the labour market where poor treatment more broadly is really kind of starting to become really, well, it's perhaps always been there, but it's kind of really at the forefront of our minds at the moment. And I think those two things kind of intersecting is kind of creating even more of a kind of difficult situation for lots of these workers.
Thank you, Hannah. There was a question at the back.
Thank you.
If you don't mind saying who you are and where you're from.
Yes, hello. I'm Maria Pavlou. I'm coming from the UK Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, and we basically connect policymakers, media, the private sector in these big conversations that are of national relevance, one of them being socioeconomic inequality, very tied in with the topic today. And I was wondering how these more kind of cultural and ideological issues around the othering that can happen within these spaces of like stripping a group of people of their humanity and therefore allowing others to exploit them, or for more of like this power dynamic and imbalance to fill that space. And also how this idea of competition also plays in with the why, that if you leave, then there'll be 100 other people behind you to fill your spot. So there's nothing that you bring that is unique to this role, because it's a very technical thing that anybody could do. So I just wonder how those two things, like this lack of humanity and also this like dynamic of competition, also feeds into the why question that was asked.
Super, yeah. So I feel like that question is half about the why and half about the effects. So I think we'll segue into that part of the discussion and maybe ask Olivia to go first, as someone who interacts a lot with the people on the front line.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try to keep this concise and to think about three facets of it at the same time. I think at the level of workers, the outcome of this employer-sponsored visa system is that it generates so much precarity. And exactly as Manoj said, that precarity doesn't just manifest in not being paid correctly or being overworked. It's also crippling levels of debt that people acquire in countries of origin, its effects on mental health, its effects on family relationships. What I think is really interesting, and we haven't covered so far, is that because this visa system effectively turns employers into gatekeepers of visas, gatekeepers of potentially life-changing opportunities for people from low and middle-income countries, it effectively creates an information market that enables agents to charge these huge fees. And people rightly believe these fees are worth paying if they're going to obtain a potentially 5-year visa with a route to settlement in the UK. Obviously, when they arrive here, so many of them find themselves in a position where they find no work and they're immobilized, indebted, and you can imagine all the consequences deriving from that. So that's the worker level. But then the system we have so far doesn't quite work for employers either. It's very expensive for employers to obtain a home office license. Bona fide employers will pay thousands of pounds on lawyer fees to ensure that they get that license and that they then have the compliance mechanisms in place, while rogue employers actually know that both the home office and wider enforcement systems are so weak, it's very likely they'll just get away with it. So it's interesting that this is one system where employers and workers could be on the same side and saying it's really not working for everyone. It corsets employers into hiring just people in particular circumstances when actually, as we know, both human rights and the market need freedom to function correctly. And the third angle I'd like to look at is the effects on the Home Office itself, because since this system was introduced, the Home Office effectively has taken on this renewed responsibility of compliance over employers, over labour rights. This was never its comfort zone. So I think what we're seeing is scandal over scandal, where the government is constantly on the back foot. So I think all these three things together just suggest how urgently needed the reform of the system is.
And when I'll wonder if any of the other panel members want to come in on this, and maybe to address the following question as well, which is, what is the effect that the existence of this group of people with poorly enforced or meagre rights and some employers who are willing to take advantage of that, what's the effect that that has on, let's say, employers who want to provide better terms and conditions? Maybe they can't afford to because of the competition. What's the effect that it has on UK-born workers or UK nationals? If anyone wants to touch on that.
I can maybe
I'm
I'll start,
gonna
but and I'm sure that my fellow discussants will have much more to add on this. But I would just say, I mean, I think the basic thrust of the kind of some of the interesting work that's been done by labour economists is that in the long term and in the aggregate, migrant workers and foreign-born workers do not have a particularly, well, let's say, have a very minimal or a negligible effect on, you know, the situation of local workers, whether that be in terms of employment or their wages. But we certainly know that in terms of specific sectors and particular workplaces, that employers will use migrant workers as a way of undermining collective labour relations or driving down wages. So we need to be particularly, I think, attentive to when that's happening and trying to figure out solutions that can prevent against that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone here wants to say something, Hannah?
Yeah, well, I definitely think that there's a real risk. I mean, as I said in the presentation and in the report, there's kind of a real risk that you basically, I mean, partly that you're basically creating almost a two-tier workforce where you've got some people who are kind of really can be subject to, like, even, you know, really poor treatment. But then if that then passes through to employers, you know, think they're basically basing their business models around being able to hire, you know, relatively, you know, cheap or low cost labour because they're able to exploit them basically, or at least give them poorer working conditions or not comply with their rights, then that kind of does perpetuate worse conditions across the workforce as a whole. And I think an argument that we've made a lot in our enforcement work in particular is that, you know, for those businesses that are doing the right thing, that are treating their workers well, kind of making sure that you're calling out and addressing poor treatment where it is happening is in basically those rogue employers is good for the businesses doing the right thing as well, because it's leveling the playing field. It's meaning that, you know, people, the kind of quote unquote good businesses aren't so easily undercut by businesses who are able to basically lower their costs by treating their workforce poorly. So I think there's lots of different arguments from across different parts of the economy for wanting to get this right.
Mm-hmm. Alan, anything to add on this one?
Shall we just go to another question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Is there a question in the room? Otherwise, I've got one online. So this relates something to you said earlier, Alan, which was, if I understood you correctly, if you think of a chart with like number of migrants on the x-axis and then rights of migrants on the y-axis, your choice is you can be in the top left. You can have relatively few migrants with very good rights, or you can be in the bottom right. So you can have lots of migrants with few rights, let's say like Dubai, whereas protagonists in the debate in the UK tend to be arguing about whether it's better to be in the top right or the bottom left, and that's not kind of a choice that's available. But is there a kind of a mild exception to this rule? Are there countries that have at least as many migrants as the UK and treat them at least as well? I'm thinking, as a non-expert, something like a Switzerland or an Australia or a Sweden.
No, I mean, the UK doesn't do badly, actually. I mean, I know we're inclined to think it's awful, but if you look, say, at Sweden and the economic outcomes for migrants in Sweden, they're terrible. So much worse than the local Swedes. I mean, personally, I know what I would choose, but I think there's sort of trade-offs, different people, just different points. I would prefer to have a society that is much more equal. And so this means strengthening rights for migrants and not allowing visas which allow employers to undercut the local labour market, but I think that means a lower level of net migration than we've currently had. It would, for example, come round to this sort of view, but it's sort of blown hot and cold in it. The social care visa was a mistake. We should look to a way to get rid of it. And that would mean no social care migrant workers coming on those visas. There would be maybe migrant workers in social care coming through other ways, but not through those specific visas.
Anyone else in the panel wants to come on, maybe with some international examples?
Yeah, I mean, there is no country that gets it 100% right, but I think there are isolated examples that we can look at. I mean, Australia is, I think, an interesting sort of comparator to give some thought to. They've had a recent review where they've sort of asked an expert panel to really think about all the different facets of labour migration and try and kind of create a cohesive strategy going forward. And there have been a few changes made to the system on that basis. I think actually there's a couple of things canvassed in the report that based on that, I think the visa that you can give to workers so that they can actually have an opportunity to vindicate some of their employment rights. So we can think about doing something like that. Canada's got interesting regulation around how you can regulate international recruiters. That's a real vector for problems, because people are being offered jobs that sometimes don't exist, or with terms and conditions that are completely different. So I think there is no country that is completely right, but there are certainly good examples that we can learn from.
Olivia, Hannah, want to come in on this, or shall we move on to the next thing?
We can move on to the next thing, yeah.
Okay, Hannah? Yeah. All right, let's move on. So we've done the why is this happening? We've done what are the effects? Now let's move on to what to do about it. And I guess thinking about international examples might help us there. But I'm going to bring up another Slido question on this topic as a way in. So when we think about things that we can do about the situation of migrants in precarious work, of course we think about what central government can do in terms of legislation and enforcement, but the central government may well be by far the most important actor in this system, but it's not the only one. There are unions, there are employers associations, there are civil society organisations, there are people who produce technology that helps workers, there is subnational government, and so there are lots of other actors in the system that can have an effect here. But maybe I'll ask the panel to start with these regional kind of voluntary agreements. Do we think that those have teeth, and they're a good place to start? Hannah?
So I think these things are really important. I mean, as well as the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, I'm also thinking of things like the real living wage, set by the Living Wage Foundation, basically voluntary kind of schemes that can be really important and can really drive up standards. I think that the caveat is that the kind of rogue employers that we're talking about, who are going to be treating their workers poorly, and in some cases exploiting them or not giving them the rights that they're due, then they're not going to be the ones kind of signing up to these really great schemes. It might, overall it might kind of increase kind of standard in most parts, but it's not necessarily going to solve the problem of really kind of pockets of really poor treatment. And I guess sort of separately, but I think the regional angle of this question is a really interesting one, because this is a problem kind of the problem of kind of precarious work and non-compliance with rules and all of the things we're talking about today. Yes, it's a kind of UK-wide thing, but we know that there are kind of pockets across the country, that there can be places of the country where it might be that the labour market is weaker, it might be that there's kind of particular things that are going on in that part of the country that mean that they're more susceptible. And I'm thinking back a few years, there was during the COVID pandemic a lot of things kind of coming to light in Leicester, where it was workers in garment factories kind of being treated poorly, and again often migrants, and that was kind of a very local thing that was in part kind of created by the features of the local labour market and the options that were out there. So I think a regional focus is a really interesting way to think about it, kind of alongside the national policy decisions that you might want to make. I guess I would say perhaps think about it from a kind of something even a bit more binding than these kind of voluntary charters. Not that they're not a really good thing, but to kind of really, as you said, make sure that they have to.
And just while we're on this topic of what to do about it, if we can bring up the poll, that would be great, so we can see what the question for you all. So this is online. Please use the QR code or the hashtag to join. And the question is, which of the following will make the single biggest change to the experience of foreign-born workers? The Employment Rights Bill, which we've heard about already, the Fair Work Agency, which we've also heard about, the Migration White Paper / Bill, an 80% employment rate, which would be hitting the government's target to increase the employment rate, and then a power rebalance. So that could, I suppose, be linked to the first four outcomes, but something else, possibly to do with trades unions or the broader developments in the labour or product market. So please have a think about these while the panel opines on the broader question of how to fix the problems that we've identified. I don't know whether, Manoj, you want to say a few words?
Look, I think maybe I've sort of mentioned some of the learning from the external other jurisdictions, but maybe the point I would make as well is that we tend to think of migration policy and law as involving, of course, the state and employers, but we really do need to think about civil society actors, because they can have a huge influence in this area. And the question is, how do you embed the work of civil society actors, trade unions, etc., in this process? And there's lots of different ways to do it, I think. One would be in terms of enforcement. Government enforcement agencies could work much more closely with organizations such as yours, Olivia, or Citizens Advice or trade unions, in terms of devising enforcement strategies that do cater specifically to the needs of migrant workers. And so, I think the question is not simply just broadly thinking about these actors, but how can you insert those actors into different facets of the process?
Olivia?
Yeah, that was fantastic. And the concrete expression of that, which could actually be in the Employment Rights Bill, would be to mandate that the advisory board that advises the Fair Work Agency includes a migrant worker contingent. I think that would go a really long way. But there are also reforms at the level of the work migration system that I think the government can make, and there are good precedents in other countries. So Manoj mentioned Australia. Recently, my colleagues at the Work Rights Centre and I did a 6-country comparative analysis. We looked at 6 high-income countries that have employer-sponsored migration systems, very similar to the one in the UK. And we looked at how they use their immigration policies to safeguard migrant workers and prevent some of these issues we discussed today. And I think there are 3 really concrete, achievable recommendations that would have no effect on net migration, but that would have a positive effect on migrant workers. And this would be increasing the time that migrant workers have to change employers. Australia gives them 6 months. Finland gives them 6 months. The UK is remarkably draconian in that list of countries. So increasing the time would be one thing. Introducing a workplace justice visa. Australia has this, Canada has this, New Zealand has this in various iterations, but effectively it's a visa that recognizes that if you're a migrant worker employed by a Home Office approved employer, there's something fundamentally unjust about that. We're going to give you a secure immigration status to enable you to report the exploitation, not worry that doing so will backfire and implode your immigration status, and give you the right to work in the country again. And the third thing would be increasing the penalties for employers who abuse the system. Again, lots of other countries are doing it. This would generate some nice revenue for the Home Office and potentially provide the finances to compensate workers.
Excellent. So I'll ask Alan to come in a minute, but maybe also to reflect on what some of the unintended consequences might be of changes in this area. I'll give you one. So there are 3 things that politicians seem to say that they want. They want a university system that charges low fees to UK undergraduates. They want the universities to be excellent and produce top quality research. And recently they've wanted to restrict the number of student visas. And many people will say, well, you can have 2 of those 3 things. So for example, if you want to restrict the number of foreign students, you're either going to have to put up tuition fees for UK students, or you're going to have to accept that lots of universities are going to be able to do much less, lower quality teaching and less research. And so, Alan, can you tell us, when you're thinking about some of the things we might do to remedy the problems that Hannah set out, what some of the unintended consequences might be?
I mean, my views on the student migration are very unpopular in universities. Firstly, I don't think the government is trying to reduce the number of international students. They're trying to limit the numbers who stay on in low-paid work post-graduation and eventually long term. And obviously, if you attach work rights to a degree, you increase the demand for a degree, but you're really doing that through a system of export subsidies. And export subsidies are generally a bad idea, I think. If we wanted foreign tourists to go on holiday to Blackpool, we could say stay for a week, work for 2 weeks afterwards. That would increase the demand for stays in Blackpool. But I don't think that would be a particularly good policy. But
I bet they love it. Hear you saying that.
yeah, I did say. So I think it's the balance. It's the balance is wrong at the moment. The work rights that go with being an international student are too big relative to that. So it's not that I'm totally against that, but we are out of balance. I think it's actually the university is also very short term. So this is a general problem. Is that short term, this is a way of dealing with the university's funding problems, but long term, it's very, very expensive. And I think that's probably also true of things like the social care visa. You think you're getting a social care worker, for 5 years, and then most of them will get settlement and so on. You've got them and their families for 50, 60 years afterwards. There is zero guarantee that they're going to be working as in social care for most of that period. Because as soon as they have the freedoms to move, they will move to other sectors for the exact same reason that Brits do, that they're better jobs in the labour market. So again, I think a lot of it is this short-termism versus short-term benefit, long-term cost has been a sort of perennial problem in migration policy.
All right, so before I bring up the poll results, I'll ask the panel if they have any final remarks. Hannah, anything you want to say at the end?
I don't know. I'm interested to see what the poll results are, because I think there's a really interesting question here about whether it's there's things that you can do on the kind of migration side. We've talked a lot about tied visas, but I think we are at kind of a really. I focus on the labour market, so I'm biased and thinking particularly about the things that can happen there. But we've got the Employment Rights Bill coming. There's a real impetus at the moment to be doing things to improve the standards across the labour market as a whole. The Fair Work Agency and kind of the enforcement side is also kind of a really core part of that. And something we haven't talked about a lot today, but the adult social care negotiating body, which given that there's the kind of very specific issues in social care and it's a kind of migrant heavy sector, I think is also if we're kind of thinking, if we're really thinking about how to make sure that these policy options and things that are going to be improving standards across the work, if we're really thinking about how to make those the most effective, it kind of makes sense to be thinking of migrant workers kind of really at the heart of a lot of those things, and thinking about how and if we're thinking about there's kind of this very specific visa kind of policy as well, but a lot of the time if we're thinking about policies that will protect migrant workers, a lot of the time those are things that will just raise standards across the labour market as a whole as well. So I think there's kind of a lot of opportunities here. So yeah.
Alan, any last words?
No, I would just go for. There are lots. You should do things in lots of things. I'd say 80% employment rate, because I think actually top down trying to protect people is a lot harder than actually if people have the ability to move, which is much easier in a strong labour market. And because most of these migrants, certainly longer term, are not on tied visas, that is the single thing that would make the biggest difference.
I
don't have a lot to add. I think I'm pleased we've been able to touch upon so many important topics in such a short span of time. Yeah.
Olivia?
This was a great conversation. It's a really complex problem. I think we agreed today that it requires fair work agency representation, immigration system reform, legal advice for employment. There is no silver bullet in my view, but I think it's really important to start by having conversations like this and to give migrant workers a voice in these forums.
Thank you very much. Well, let's bring up the results of the poll and see what the public thinks. A power rebalance, okay. And Alan's 80% rate is nobody wants to see an 80% employment rate. Well, maybe one way to get the employment rate, to get the power rebalance, Alan, what you're saying is to get the 80% employment rate.
Yeah, I think that would help a lot.
The least chosen option is a means to the most chosen option, if you like. All right, well, in that case, I'd just like to thank my fellow panelists and the audience, both online and in Westminster, and wish you all a very happy Monday.